Most people who follow aviation can list the same few American disasters by heart. But behind those famous names is a second layer of crashes that almost never show up in documentaries. Regional flights into small cities, cargo runs in the dark, short hops that ended in fields, rivers, and hangars most people have never heard of. In this video, we stay in the United States and look at those little-known accidents. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and support us for more. On the morning of January 8, 2003, Air Midwest Flight 5481 was scheduled for a short hop from Charlotte to Greenville-Spartanburg. 19 passengers took their seats in the small cabin. 2 young pilots strapped into the cockpit, and the plane pushed back from the gate just like it had hundreds of times before. Nothing in the conditions outside hinted that this flight would last barely half a minute in the air. The captain, Catherine Leslie, was 25 years old, the youngest captain at the airline, but she was experienced with over 1,800 hours on company aircraft. Pre-flight paperwork indicated that everything was within limits: weight, balance, and fuel. However, what the numbers didn't show was that the airline's average passenger weight estimates were badly out of date, and ramp agents had loaded unusually heavy bags into the rear cargo bin. It was overweight, with its center of gravity dangerously pushed back toward the tail. At about 8:46 a.m., the crew lined up on the runway and advanced the power. The twin turboprop accelerated, rotated, and began to climb. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. As soon as the wheels left the ground, the nose pitched up far more aggressively than expected. Within seconds, the pitch angle passed 20 degrees and kept increasing. Captain Leslie and First Officer Gibbs both pushed forward on their controls, trying desperately to bring the nose down, but the plane barely responded. The stall warning blared as the aircraft clawed its way to just over 1,000 feet, the nose now rearing toward 50 degrees. For a few terrifying seconds, they hung in the air, fighting a losing battle. Then, the lift finally broke. The plane stalled, rolled, and dropped into a steep dive. The aircraft slammed into a maintenance hangar just 37 seconds after liftoff. The impact and subsequent fire destroyed the plane and part of the building. All 21 people on board were killed. It looked as if the plane had simply run out of pitch control. The investigation quickly confirmed that the engines were producing normal power. Instead, 2 separate problems had aligned in a way neither the crew nor the regulators had anticipated. The first was weight. For years, carriers used standard average passenger weights that were outdated. Investigators discovered the plane had left the gate roughly 580 pounds heavier than calculated, with the center of gravity aft of the allowable limit. On this small aircraft, that meant the nose naturally wanted to pitch up during the climb. However, the weight alone shouldn't have been fatal. The second problem was hidden in the tail. 2 nights before the crash, mechanics had adjusted the elevator control cables using poorly written procedures. The mechanic had never performed this specific task on this type of aircraft before, and the oversight was weak. Consequently, the elevator system was misrigged, giving the pilots less nose-down authority than the design allowed. There was no cockpit indicator to warn them, and taxi checks on the ground felt normal. The plane created a deadly trap. The aft-shifted center of gravity caused the nose to rise aggressively, while the misrigged elevator meant the crew couldn't push it back down. Either problem alone might have been survivable. Together, they made recovery impossible. No matter how hard the pilots pushed on the controls, the elevator simply couldn't bite enough air to prevent the stall. On the morning of August 27, 2006, Comair Flight 5191 prepared for the first departure of the day from Lexington, Kentucky. The aircraft, operating as a Delta connection flight to Atlanta, carried 47 passengers and 3 crew members. The weather was calm and clear, but it was still pitch black before dawn. The crew started a taxi that should have taken them to a long runway designed for jets. Instead, in the darkness, they lined up on a much shorter strip built for light aircraft, a mistake no one realized until there was nothing left in front of them but grass and trees. The captain, Jeffrey Clay, was 35 years old, with nearly 4,000 flight hours. In the right seat sat 44-year-old First Officer James Polhinky. They completed their paperwork and pushed back from the gate just after 6 a.m., with dawn only just beginning to lighten the horizon. Bluegrass Airport had 2 intersecting runways. The assigned runway, runway 22, was about 7,000 feet long and suitable for jets. The other, runway 26, was only about 3,500 feet long and intended for small general aviation aircraft. Recent construction had altered taxiway markings and signs, making the layout potentially confusing. While the charts were accurate, the physical changes on the ground, combined with inoperative lights, made it dangerously easy to get turned around in the dark. Ground control cleared the flight to the long runway. The crew read back the clearance correctly. The captain missed the specific turn required to reach the long runway and instead followed a more direct path leading to the short one. Neither pilot verbalized a clear cross-check of the runway signage or heading as they approached the threshold. There were clues they were in the wrong place. The correct runway had centerline lights. The short one did not. The painted numbers were different, but in the dark, without other aircraft to serve as reference points, the crew missed them. The tower controller, lacking surface radar, could see the plane's navigation lights, but not the pavement beneath it. Believing they were at the correct threshold, he cleared them for takeoff. The captain advanced the thrust levers, and the aircraft began to accelerate. Almost immediately, something felt off. On the short runway, the available distance was far below what the jet required. At rotation speed, the captain pulled back on the controls, and the nose came up, but there was no runway left. The aircraft ran off the end of the pavement, clipped a perimeter fence, and slammed into a stand of trees. The impact tore the plane apart, and the wreckage burst into flames. 49 of the 50 people on board died. The sole survivor was the first officer, who was badly injured and had no memory of the crash. Investigators quickly realized the core issue. How did an experienced crew, with a correct clearance, choose the wrong runway? The NTSB found a fatal alignment of factors. Fatigue and airport construction played a role, but the primary failure was in the cockpit. The crew had failed to cross-check their instruments and the runway markers against their clearance. Their non-essential conversation during taxi had eroded their vigilance, causing them to miss the warning signs, like the lack of lights that could have saved them. Comair Flight 5191 stands as a tragic defining example of a wrong runway accident, highlighting how easily routine and distraction can turn a simple taxi instruction into a disaster. On November 19, 1996, United Express Flight 5925 left Burlington, Iowa, for a short flight to Quincy, Illinois. On board were 12 people. The weather was clear, and the destination was a small, quiet airport with no control tower. In this environment, safety depended entirely on pilots talking to each other on a shared radio channel and trusting that everyone knew where everyone else was. Quincy Municipal Airport had two intersecting runways arranged in an X, runway 13 and runway 04. Separation depended entirely on pilot communication. As Flight 5925 descended, two other aircraft were preparing to depart, a King Air and a Piper Cherokee. Both were taxiing toward runway 04. All three crews were supposed to coordinate their movements on the common traffic advisory frequency. Captain Kate Gathje and First Officer Darren McCombs flew the approach to runway 13. To ensure safety at the intersection, Gathje asked on the radio if the departing traffic would hold short. The King Air didn't answer immediately. A few seconds later, the pilot of the Piper Cherokee replied that they would hold short of runway 04. However, inside the United Express cockpit, a ground proximity warning tone sounded at the exact moment the Cherokee pilot spoke. The two sounds overlapped. Instead of hearing "Cherokee will hold short," the crew heard a fragmented "They're going to hold short." This caused a fatal misunderstanding. Gathje and McCombs believed both aircraft on the ground were waiting for them. Flight 5925 landed on runway 13. Simultaneously, the King Air crew, who had not effectively monitored the radio, taxied onto runway 04 and began their takeoff roll. Neither crew realized they were on a collision course. As the United Express plane rolled through the intersection, the King Air suddenly appeared from the right. There was no time to stop. At 17:01, the two aircraft collided at the center of the X. The King Air struck the side of the United Express aircraft. The wreckage skidded to a halt and caught fire. Remarkably, all 12 people aboard Flight 5925 survived the initial impact. However, the crash turned into a tragedy on the ground. The main passenger door was jammed by the twisted fuselage. Rescuers on the scene struggled to open it but failed. With no airport fire trucks or trained crash crews available, the fire grew uncontrollable. Trapped inside, all 12 people on the United Express flight, along with the two pilots of the King Air, died from smoke inhalation. The investigation revealed a chain of failures. The King Air crew had failed to monitor the frequency or visually check for traffic. The interrupted radio transmission led the United Express crew to believe the runway was clear. The NTSB cited the King Air pilot's failure to see and avoid as the probable cause, with the radio overlap and the lack of airport rescue capabilities as contributing factors. On the afternoon of September 6, 1985, Midwest Express Flight 105, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, lined up at Milwaukee's General Mitchell Airport for a trip to Atlanta. For the 27 passengers and 4 crew members on board, everything about this departure looked completely normal. The cockpit setup, however, was unusual. Instead of a traditional captain-first officer pairing, Flight 105 had 2 captains. 31-year-old Danny Martin was the pilot flying, while 37-year-old Bill Weiss, a senior pilot, acted in the first officer role. Both were highly experienced, with thousands of flight hours. But the airline's culture enforced an unwritten, silent cockpit philosophy. Below 800 feet, pilots were expected not to talk unless it was for required callouts. On paper, it was meant to ensure focus. In practice, Flight 105 would prove how silence can block the one thing needed most in an emergency: communication. At about 3:20 p.m., the DC-9 took off into the clear September sky. Everything looked normal until the plane reached roughly 700 feet when the right engine exploded. A fatigued spacer in the compressor had failed, sending metal fragments through the engine casing and starting a fire. One engine had failed completely, but the other was still producing power, and the DC-9 was certified to climb away safely on a single engine. Captain Martin reacted immediately. "What the hell was that? What do we got here, Bill?" On a standard flight deck, these questions would trigger a rapid cross-check, identifying the engine, checking the gauges, and confirming the plan. Instead, Weiss stayed silent. He did not read out the instruments. He did not say which engine had failed. His voice only appears on the tape when declaring an emergency to the tower. To the captain sitting next to him, he offered nothing. The memory of the silent cockpit rule, combined with the shock of the explosion, left the non-flying pilot effectively mute, right when Martin needed a second set of eyes most. While the crew failed to connect, the plane entered a dangerous performance state. The explosion had jolted the aircraft, and Martin reacted by pulling the nose up and using the rudder to fight the yaw. In a simulator, the correct response is subtle: hold a modest climb and protect airspeed above all else. But with no one saying "watch your speed," Martin allowed the pitch angle to increase steeply. As the speed dropped, the DC-9 rolled further to the right. From the first bang to the moment the aircraft was beyond recovery took only a handful of seconds. There was no time for checklists, no time for a briefing, only time for instinct, which was never corrected by a second voice. The aircraft never climbed higher than 700 feet. It rolled and dived into a wildlife preserve, exploding on impact. All 31 people on board were killed. To bystanders, it looked as if a simple engine failure had knocked the plane out of the sky. To investigators, the question was harder. Why had a flyable jet ended up in a fatal stall? The physical cause was straightforward: metal fatigue in a sleeve spacer. But flight data proved the DC-9 should have been controllable. The NTSB report focused squarely on improper control inputs and a breakdown in coordination. Martin pitched too high and allowed the speed to decay, while Weiss, who could see the same instruments, never gave the verbal support to stop that trend in time. The underlying cause was culture. Midwest's silent cockpit concept discouraged open discussion below 800 feet, even in an emergency. The NTSB concluded that this philosophy, combined with the pairing of 2 captains and gaps in training, undercut the basic idea of crew resource management. Flight 105 became a tragic case study in what happens when procedure values silence over communication. UPS Airlines Flight 1354 left Louisville, Kentucky in the early hours of August 14, 2013, on a routine cargo run to Birmingham, Alabama. The aircraft was an Airbus A300 freighter, with 2 pilots on board, flying while most of the city was still asleep. It was a night arrival just before dawn, the kind of work cargo crews do every day: depart late, arrive early, unload packages before the morning rush. The weather around Birmingham was mixed. Over the airport itself, conditions were good enough for a visual landing, but north of the field, there were patches of low cloud and haze. For this flight, the real difficulty was not the weather alone, but the combination of the time of day, the type of approach available, and a crew that was more tired than they should have been. The main runway at Birmingham, runway 06, which had a full instrument landing system with vertical guidance, was closed for maintenance until 5 o'clock. That left only the shorter runway 18. This runway offered a localizer approach, which gives side-to-side guidance, but no built-in vertical path. This is known as a non-precision approach. It requires the crew to manage their own descent profile manually and respect a specific minimum altitude. Since the flight was scheduled to arrive just before the main runway reopened, runway 18 was their only option. The captain and first officer did not receive a thorough briefing on this limitation. The airline dispatcher didn't discuss the runway closure or the forecast of variable clouds. In the cockpit, both pilots were also carrying a personal burden: fatigue. The captain had slept poorly before the flight. The first officer had been awake much of the previous night and had complained about how cargo schedules made it hard to get real rest. On the recorder, they talked openly about being tired, about how their bodies weren't adjusted to night work, and about how the rules allowed them to fly even when they didn't feel sharp. As the plane neared Birmingham, the crew heard the automated broadcast. Runway 06 was closed, and traffic was using the localizer approach to runway 18. The captain's reaction was resigned. It figures. He briefed the procedure, but the discussion was shallow. There was no deep focus on the minimum descent altitude, the absolute floor they shouldn't cross without seeing the runway. At one point, the first officer mentioned that a precision approach would be nice, but they didn't have that option. On the way down, air traffic control cleared the jet for the approach. The crew chose to fly the descent, using a simple vertical speed mode, dialing in a steady rate of descent rather than using the plane's more advanced navigation tools. Vertical speed mode is easy to use, but risky. If the crew doesn't constantly cross-check altitude against distance, the path can drift dangerously low. On a dark night with few visual cues, it requires especially tight monitoring. As the aircraft came closer to the airport, the descent path became too steep, the nose stayed down, and the sink rate increased. The approach was now unstable. The proper decision would have been a go-around, climbing back up to try again. Instead, the crew continued, their heads mostly inside the cockpit, making small adjustments as the ground rushed up toward them. The minimum descent altitude was a clear number on the chart. The plane should have leveled off there until the runway was in sight. Instead, the descent continued through that altitude. Flight data showed neither pilot was effectively monitoring the altimeter. About 16 seconds before the end, a warning system called out, "Sink rate," twice. 3 seconds later, the captain said he had the runway in sight. The first officer agreed, but that visual sighting came far too late. They were still descending, below the minimum altitude, and didn't realize how close they were to the rising terrain. Roughly 3 seconds after they claimed to see the runway, the plane hit the tops of trees. The recorder captured the sound of branches striking the fuselage, followed by a final, too low terrain alert. The aircraft slammed into an uphill slope about 1 kilometer short of the runway. It broke apart and caught fire. Both pilots were killed. There was no time for a mayday call, no time for a pull-up. Investigators concluded there was nothing wrong with the aircraft itself. The core of the accident was human. The crew flew an unstable approach, failed to monitor their altitude, and descended below the minimums without a safe visual reference. Fatigue had dulled their judgment. The lack of a strong dispatcher briefing meant they weren't mentally prepared for the demands of a non-precision night approach. On the afternoon of January 9, 1997, Comair Flight 3272 departed Cincinnati for a short hop to Detroit. The aircraft was an Embraer Brasilia, a 30-seat twin-engine turboprop common on regional routes. On board were 26 passengers, 2 pilots, and 1 flight attendant. The flight was routine, but the weather over Michigan was poor. Thick clouds, light snow, and known icing conditions. For crews flying this route, navigating through ice was just part of the job. The captain, 42-year-old Dan Carlson, had over 5,000 flight hours. The first officer, 29-year-old Kenneth Reese, had about 2,500 hours. They were experienced and familiar with cold weather operations. However, they carried a set of beliefs passed down for years, that de-icing boots should not be used too early, and that inflating them too soon might cause ice bridging, creating a hollow shell of ice that worsens the problem. While this was true for older systems, on a modern Embraer, it was a dangerous myth. The aircraft climbed to cruising altitude without incident. As they neared Detroit, air traffic control cleared them down to 4,000 feet. The entire descent happened inside clouds containing supercooled water droplets. As the plane flew through, a thin layer of rough ice began to form on the wings. It was likely hard to see from the cockpit, but aerodynamically, that roughness was enough to dangerously alter how the wing stalled. By this time, the manufacturer had already updated its guidance, telling operators to activate boots at the first sign of ice and maintain higher speeds. But Comair's manuals still reflected older thinking, instructing crews to wait for visible ice accumulation. The airline's practices, influenced by slow-to-adapt regulatory guidance, were still treating ice bridging as a serious threat, even though tests showed it didn't occur on this aircraft type. As the plane descended toward 4,000 feet, the crew kept the autopilot engaged. When ATC asked them to slow for spacing, they reduced speed with the flaps retracted. The airspeed trended down through the range considered safe for icing. The autopilot trimmed the aircraft to maintain altitude, masking the increased drag and hiding the fact that the margin above stall was rapidly shrinking. In the cockpit, there was no obvious alarm. The gauges looked normal until the difference between flying and stalling became critical. Near the end of the approach, the captain noticed the low speed and asked for more power. It was a cautious move, but it came too late. A few seconds later, with thin ice on the wings and airspeed near the limit, the wing stalled. It wasn't a gentle nod. The aircraft snapped into a violent roll, swinging left, then right, then left again, pitching into a steep dive. The autopilot disconnected, handing full control back to the pilots exactly when the plane was unflyable. Carlson and Reese tried to recover, but they had almost no altitude left. The descent rate was too high for a recovery. Seconds later, the aircraft slammed into a snow-covered field near Raisinville Township. The impact and fire destroyed the plane. All 29 people on board were killed. Investigators quickly suspected icing. The NTSB brought in NASA specialists to model the accident. Studies confirmed that even a small amount of rough ice could significantly reduce the wing's stall margin, especially at low speeds. The final report didn't blame a single pilot error. Instead, it focused on the system, the Federal Aviation Administration's inadequate certification standards, the lack of clear minimum speed definitions, and the airline's outdated procedures on boot use. The crash exposed the deadly icing myth. The danger wasn't just the ice itself, but the belief that pilots should wait to use the de-icing boots. The accident proved that on modern turboprops, thin, almost invisible ice was enough to kill. In the years following, aviation regulators and the industry rewrote the rulebook, tightening certification standards and changing training to ensure crews activate protection systems at the first sign of ice, rather than waiting for a danger they might not see until it's too late. Northwest Airlink Flight 5719 was a short commuter leg in northern Minnesota on the night of December 1, 1993. A British aerospace Jetstream 31 left Minneapolis for International Falls with a planned stop at Hibbing. On board were 18 people, most of them heading home to small towns in the Iron Range. Outside, the weather was winter night IFR with low cloud and light freezing drizzle. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was already tense before the plane ever took off. The captain, 42-year-old Marvin Felitz, had a long and uneven training record that included multiple failed check rides. Colleagues had described him as argumentative, easily angered, and rough with both passengers and co-pilots. His first officer, 25-year-old Chad Erickson, was new on the Jetstream, with only a few dozen hours on type and still in his probationary period. He knew about the captain's reputation before they met, and understood that a bad review from this flight could hurt his career. That imbalance set the tone. From the start of the shift in Minneapolis, the captain criticized and micromanaged Erickson, snapping at small mistakes and correcting even trivial actions. By the time the plane finally left the gate, the first officer had already learned that speaking up carried a personal risk. The flight left Minneapolis about 40 minutes late, after a delay to change landing light bulbs and sort out a small weight and balance issue. The leg to Hibbing itself was uneventful at cruise altitude. As the plane neared its intermediate stop, the crew began discussing how they would get into an airport sitting under a low overcast with reported icing in the cloud layer. Air traffic control initially cleared them for an instrument landing system approach to a runway pointing to the northwest, runway 31, but that would have meant landing with a tailwind on a contaminated surface. The captain instead asked for a localizer back course approach to runway 13, which pointed into the wind but had no full ILS guidance. That choice raised the workload sharply. A back-course approach uses the localizer signal from the opposite direction and requires careful mental reversal of the indications. On top of that, the published procedure for runway 13 included a distance-measuring equipment arc, a curved path around the airport flown at a constant distance before intercepting the localizer. The crew would have to manage the arc, the back course, step-down altitudes, icing, and a low ceiling that left almost no extra room beneath the minimum descent altitude. It was exactly the kind of approach that demands quiet discipline, stable profiles, and strong crew coordination. Instead of following the published vertical profile, the captain came up with his own plan. Other pilots at the company had been informally using an unapproved technique in icing conditions. Stay high as long as possible, then drop quickly through the cloud to minimize time in the ice. The Jetstream had effective de-icing boots and could safely fly in light to moderate icing if flown by the book, but this shortcut had become part of the local culture. The captain decided to remain at 8,000 feet around most of the DME arc, then make a steep descent toward the step-down altitude rather than come down in stages as the chart required. He did not brief this change clearly. He simply kept the plane high and expected his first officer to keep up. On the cockpit voice recorder, almost every interaction goes in one direction. The captain issues orders and critiques. He tells the first officer how to phrase radio calls, how to handle checklists, how to set up radios, even how to clip the approach chart. The corrections keep coming, even for small things Erickson could easily have done himself. Under that constant pressure, the first officer becomes quieter and less assertive. Procedures required him to call out high descent rates, altitude targets, and key heights above terrain during the approach. In practice, he made almost none of those callouts. The more the captain controlled everything, the less the junior pilot did the one job the flight now needed most: monitoring altitude and descent. When the captain finally began the descent, he pushed the jet stream into a rate of about 2,250 feet per minute, more than double what company rules and federal guidance considered appropriate. The plane crossed the final approach fix still too high, and still descending quickly, with the captain deliberately trying to dive and level onto the profile instead of flying a stable path. Somewhere in that rush, altitude awareness started to slip. The step-down altitude of 2,040 feet came and went. The airplane passed through it without leveling off, and continued down, still at a high sink rate, into blackness below the base of the cloud. The first officer did manage one key call. He said 1 to go when they were 1,000 feet above their target step-down altitude. That was a crucial moment. It should have focused both pilots on the next level off and the minimum descent altitude that followed. Instead, the captain responded with a brief question about what altitude they were going to, then immediately diverted his colleague's attention to a side task. He told Erickson to make sure the common traffic advisory frequency was set and to click the microphone to turn on the runway lights at the uncontrolled airport. With less than a minute left before impact, both pilots put their attention into getting the lights on, rather than rechecking the altimeter and the descent rate. The plane slipped through the minimum descent altitude of 1,780 feet, with no one calling it and no one leveling off. There was no ground proximity warning system on board to shout, "Pull up." The jet stream continued down at more than 1,000 feet per minute toward rising terrain in an old mining area short of the airport. Out the windows, there was only darkness. In the cockpit, there was no sense of urgency. A few seconds later, the right wing hit the top of a tree on a ridge, slicing off branches and metal. The plane then clipped more trees, rolled, and slammed into the opposite slope, coming to rest broken on its side. All 18 people on board died instantly. No distress call was ever made. Investigators quickly determined that the engines and major systems had been working properly, and that icing was not the primary cause. This was a controlled flight into terrain. Radar data, the cockpit recording, and interviews with other pilots at the airline painted the rest of the picture. The company had allowed a hazardous shortcut descent technique to spread in its jet stream fleet. The captain had a long history of weak communication, poor judgment, and aggressive behavior that management never fully confronted. The first officer, young and on probation, had every reason to fear a negative evaluation if he contradicted the man in the left seat. In that environment, basic crew resource management simply did not exist. Trans World Airlines, Flight 514, left Columbus, Ohio, on the morning of December 1, 1974, as a routine leg into Washington National Airport at the end of Thanksgiving weekend. The aircraft was a Boeing 727 with 92 people on board, flying into weather that was ugly but normal for the season. Low cloud, rain, turbulence, and strong winds sweeping across the East Coast. For most passengers, this was just a bumpy arrival at the end of a holiday. For the crew, the real problems would start not with the storm itself, but with a diversion, a set of altitudes on a chart, and a few words from air traffic control that did not mean the same thing to everyone who heard them. High crosswinds at National made landings unsafe on the main north-south runway, so controllers began diverting arrivals to Washington Dulles. The plane was one of those flights. Instead of an ILS into the city airport by the river, the crew now had to set up for a non-precision approach to runway 12 at Dulles. They had the correct chart. They briefed the procedure. The approach had a series of step-down altitudes that kept aircraft above the ridges, west of the airport, until they were closer in. One of those numbers, 1,800 feet, would later become the center of the entire case. As the plane approached from the northwest, Dulles Approach Control cleared it down to 7,000 feet and vectored it toward the field. The crew expected to join the published approach somewhere along its course. On the radio, the controller then said the phrase that every airline crew heard many times a day in that era: "Cleared for the approach." To the controller, that meant the flight could now follow the published procedure, but should maintain 7,000 feet until it was established on one of the depicted segments. To the pilots, who were not yet on the printed inbound track, the phrase sounded like a green light to descend straight toward the first step-down altitude on the chart, 1,800 feet, even though they were still well outside the point where that restriction applied. In the cockpit, there were signs of uncertainty. The crew discussed exactly what the clearance allowed. They wondered whether they were still under radar control or fully on their own navigation. They talked about 1,800 feet as the next altitude. No one called the controller for clarification. The captain began a descent from 7,000 toward 1,800, treating the clearance as permission to go all the way down. Outside the windows, the view was solid cloud and blowing snow. Inside, the altimeters unwound while the navigation instruments showed the plane tracking roughly toward the inbound course. The storm added turbulence and downdrafts that made it harder to hold a precise height. But the main trend was simple. The airplane was leaving a safe minimum altitude and moving into terrain that climbed up to meet it. The published procedure for runway 12 had a minimum altitude of 3,400 feet until much closer to the airport. At that height, the ridges around Mount Weather were comfortably below the flight path. At 1,800 feet, they were not. The plane leveled briefly near 1,800, then oscillated a little in the bumps, with small altitude deviations that the crew attributed to vertical gusts. There was no ground proximity warning system to shout at them, and no terrain display to paint the ridge ahead. Radar controllers could see altitude and position, but at that time, the minimum safe altitude warning tools used today did not exist. On paper, the crew believed they were on the approach. In reality, they were well below any safe altitude for that segment. At 11:09 in the morning, still in controlled flight, the plane struck trees on the west slope of Mount Weather at about 1,700 feet above sea level. The left wing began cutting through treetops roughly 70 feet above the ground. Moments later, the fuselage hit a rock outcropping near the ridge crest. The impact tore the airplane apart and started multiple post-crash fires along the wreckage path. Everyone on board was killed. The summit of Mount Weather stood only a short distance higher. If the crew had remained at 3,400 feet until established as the chart intended, the mountain would have passed well below them in cloud, unnoticed. The investigation found no mechanical failure that could have caused the descent. The engines were producing power, the navigation equipment was working, and the control systems were intact until impact. The problem lay in human systems. Interviews and testimony showed that many airline crews at the time believed that cleared for the approach meant they could descend to the lowest altitude associated with the procedure, even if they were not yet on a published segment. Many controllers believed the same phrase meant something narrower. Cleared to follow the procedure, but still required to maintain the last assigned altitude until actually established. In other words, pilots and controllers were using the same words for two different rules, and nobody had realized how dangerous that gap could be. During the hearings, investigators discovered that a United Airlines crew had almost hit the same mountain on the same approach only weeks earlier. In that case, the pilots also began an early descent, then realized from their instruments and the terrain clearance that something was wrong and climbed away in time. They later filed a voluntary safety report with NASA, describing the confusion over cleared for the approach. That report and the crash on Mount Weather came together to push the system in a new direction. Aviation regulators and NASA created the Aviation Safety Reporting System, a confidential program that encourages pilots and controllers to report incidents and near misses without fear of punishment, so that patterns like this can be fixed before they kill people instead of after. Atlas Air Flight 3591 left Miami on February 23, 2019, as a routine cargo run to Houston. The plane was a Boeing 767 freighter, carrying packages for Amazon and 3 people in the cockpit: a captain, a first officer, and an off-duty pilot in the jump seat. It was a daytime flight along a busy corridor, into a major airport the crew had seen many times before. For almost the entire trip, the flight was uneventful. The problem started only in the last minute, as the plane descended toward Houston and crossed the leading edge of a weather front north of the city. As the flight neared its destination, air traffic control gave the crew vectors and descent clearances for an approach to George Bush Intercontinental Airport. The weather near the airport was good enough for normal operations, but the plane had to pass through a band of cloud and light turbulence along the front. Inside that cloud, the pilots could no longer see the ground or horizon. They had to rely only on their instruments to understand the airplane's attitude, speed, and path. The captain and first officer divided their roles in the standard way. One flew the airplane, the other handled radio calls and monitoring. On this leg, the first officer was the one controlling the flight. The plane's automatic systems were doing most of the work. The autopilot followed the headings and altitudes given by air traffic control, An automatic thrust system adjusted the power to match the descent. The crew began configuring the plane for arrival, extending the first stage of flaps and using the speed brake lever on the center console to fine-tune their rate of descent. All of this was normal. What came next was not. As the plane passed through the front, with some turbulence and changing winds, the first officer's left hand was on or near the speed brake. At some point in that brief window, his wrist or watch likely bumped a nearby switch by accident. That switch controlled go-around mode. Go-around mode is a preset command that tells the airplane to abandon the descent and start climbing again. When a pilot presses it on purpose during an approach, the computers increase engine thrust and pitch the nose up so the plane can climb safely away for another try. On this day, nobody called for a go-around. The evidence shows that the mode was activated unintentionally. The engines began to spool up. The automation started to command a slight nose-up attitude, exactly as designed, even though the crew still believed they were simply descending toward Houston. Neither pilot said out loud that they saw the change. They did not call go-around, and they did not disconnect the automation. Instead, only a few seconds after the mode change, the first officer pushed the control column sharply forward. The data, combined with what is known about human perception, suggests that he experienced a powerful false sensation. As the engines accelerated and the plane's forward speed increased inside the cloud, it felt to him as if the nose were suddenly pitching up too much. Without outside visual references, a pilot's inner ear can be tricked in exactly this way, creating the impression of a steep climb when the instruments show only a modest nose-up attitude. Faced with that sensation, he reacted as if the plane were about to stall, even though there was no stall warning and the airspeed was normal. The forward push on the control column overrode the autopilot. Instead of climbing, the plane pitched down. Over the next half-minute, it dropped from a stable descent into a very steep dive. The nose went down to a high angle, the speed built rapidly, and the descent rate reached thousands of feet per minute. In the cockpit, there were brief, confused comments, but no clear statement of what was happening, and no organized recovery. The captain did not take control or make strong opposite inputs in time. By the time both pilots fully understood that the airplane was in a nose-down plunge, the ground was already coming up fast. Still inside cloud, the crew could not see the surface of Trinity Bay below them. When the airplane finally broke out of the bottom of the weather, it was only a few thousand feet above the water and pointing almost directly at it. There was no space left for a controlled pullout. At high speed, the 767 slammed into the shallow bay near Anahuac, Texas, breaking apart in the mud and water. All 3 people on board were killed. There was no distress call, and no fire in the air. Witnesses on the ground saw only a cargo jet suddenly appear from the clouds in a steep, almost vertical dive and disappear into the bay. The investigation ruled out structural failure, bird strikes, and engine problems. The wreckage and recorder data showed that the plane was mechanically healthy until impact. The key clues came from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. They showed the exact moment when go-around mode was triggered, the automatic increase in thrust, the small nose-up command from the computers, and then the much larger manual nose-down control inputs from the first officer. They also showed that stall warning systems never activated. From this, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the first officer had likely bumped the go-around switch by accident, then misread the situation inside cloud and responded as if the plane were pitching up too steeply, when in fact, it was not. Most people who follow aviation can list the big American disasters. The flights in this video are the other ones. The small commuter runs and night cargo trips that almost no one outside the industry has heard of. A plane that could not climb away because it was heavier and more tail-heavy than anyone realized. A regional jet that rolled down the wrong strip in the dark and had no runway left. A short hop that stalled in thin winter ice because crews were still taught an old myth about de-icing. A quiet descent that ended in trees or on a hillside simply because nobody said, "Stop, this is too low." None of these accidents became famous, but they quietly rewrote the rulebook. They changed how we weigh airplanes, how we brief runways, how we fly non-precision approaches without vertical guidance, how we treat ice, how we monitor each other in the cockpit, and how we search a pilot's history before handing over a wide body. Today, thousands of flights cross the United States every day, without incident, partly because of lessons learned from places like Quincy, Monroe, Hibbing, Mount Weather, Birmingham, and Trinity Bay. If you want more long, calm documentaries about real flights that changed aviation in these quiet ways, you can subscribe to Terra Obscura, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which incident, airline, or era you want to see next.